Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of Anton Pannekoek and the Socialism of Worker Self-Emancipation 1873 to 1960 by John Gerber. Chapter 6 is titled Struggling Marxism in Practice, 1910 to 1914, and it has the headings Break with the Marxist Center, Pannekoek against Kautsky, Militants against the apparatus, the Bremen left, and, quote, sect or party, the Dutch SDP. So here we go. First section, the break with the Marxist center, Pannekoek against Kautsky. For Pannekoek, the years 1910 to 1914 were extraordinary ones of intense practical activity at the base of German social democracy, which by a painful process brought him into opposition to official social democracy. Although his influence in the SPD was at its zenith, Pannekoek by 1909 was becoming increasingly disenchanted with his activities at the summit of German social democracy. Living in the middle-class suburb of Sellendorf, where he was deprived of a local party section in which to participate, Pannekoek found his contacts confined to the heads and functionaries of the party and began to feel increasingly isolated from the active life of the movement. He felt that his theoretical work often had an abstract and sterile character because it was not rooted in any living reality. Writing later at this period in his life, Pannekoek spoke of it as a, quote, life among the gods, end quote, a, quote, world apart that was completely different from the real world, end quote. Pannekoek went on to draw the conclusion that the leadership of German social democracy was little more than a, quote, interest group of their own, end quote, completely detached from the base of the party. These growing doubts about his work in Berlin were compounded by the considerable financial uncertainties that his journalistic work carried with it. He compared his difficulties in finding subscribers to his correspondence articles to the experiences of a small grocer who continually sees his customers leave and envies the stable salaried man who has a fixed income to count on. In 1909, deep fissures were also gradually emerging in Pannekoek's relationship with Kautsky. Although Pannekoek continued to be a regular Sunday dinner guest at the Kautsky household, the close harmony that characterized the early years of their relationship was no longer present. In early 1909, Kautsky expressed major reservations about Pannekoek's view of Marxism and Darwinism. Kautsky also felt Pannekoek's basic Dietzgen methodology and his emphasis on the, quote, spiritual factors in social development were incompatible with a Marxist perspective. But the issue that evoked Pannekoek's wrath was Kautsky's refusal to support the tribunists when they faced expulsion from the SDAP. Pannekoek accused Kautsky of having, quote, deserted Marxism and suggested that Kautsky's intervention could have prevented the tribunist expulsion. These emerging differences between Pannekoek and Kautsky, however, were overshadowed by a more fundamental process of political differentiation which was developing within German social democracy since 1905. What had hitherto been confined to latent theoretical differences crystallized suddenly into divergent strategic perspectives in the spring of 1910. These events began on February 4th when the Bethmann-Hollweg government released the draft of its long-awaited suffrage reform bill, which proposed almost no changes. Demonstrations broke out almost immediately in Berlin and the larger Prussian towns and continued throughout February and March. The high point of this movement came with the Berlin demonstration of March 6th, which drew 150,000 persons despite a police ban. This mood of militancy and unrest received additional reinforcement from a set of parallel large-scale strikes in the economic sector, which involved nearly 370,000 workers during the course of 1910. From March onwards, the suffrage and strike movements began increasingly to overlap, leading many to see the long-awaited merging of political and economic forms of struggle. The first major tactical confrontation came in late February when Rosa Luxemburg drafted a long article entitled "What Further?", calling for intensification of the suffrage movement. When both Furvarts and the Neue Zeit refused to print the article, Luxemburg began a 2-month speaking tour of Germany in order to bring the question directly to the rank and file. In order to justify the position of the executive, Kautsky launched the first of a series of verbal assaults on Rosa Luxemburg and left with a serialized Neue Zeit article entitled, and the left with a serialized Neue Zeit article entitled "Was nun?" What now?, in which he defended a return to parliamentary tactics. Kautsky argued that the excitement of the masses was not nearly sufficient for such a, quote, extreme course as the mass strike, and advocated instead a, quote, strategy of attrition. Ermittlungsstrategie. For Kautsky, the real task of the party was to organize the proletariat for the Reichstag elections 2 years away. A victory in these elections, Kautsky felt, would create the conditions for a final, quote, strategy of overthrow, unquote. To ensure this victory, the party had the, quote, duty to utilize the organization to prevent all attempts at premature mass strike. To ensure this victory, the party had the, quote, duty to, quote, utilize the organization to prevent all attempts at a premature mass strike, unquote. At Rosa Luxemburg's request, Pannekoek entered the debate in April 1910 with a series of articles defending her position. Pannekoek declared openly that the key issue confronting the movement was the contradiction between the will to struggle of the masses and the inability of the party leadership to give expression to that will. Against Kautsky's, quote, strategy of attrition, unquote, Pannekoek asserted the need for an offensive strategy aimed ultimately at destroying the foundation of the capitalist state through intensification of mass movements. Pannekoek's position was premised on his belief that the mass struggles of the spring of 1910 were fundamentally different from all previous forms of mass action, since for the first time the proletariat possessed a conscious knowledge of both its situation and its mission. He felt that this, quote, new revolutionary disposition of the masses, unquote, represented a critical turning point in the history of the socialist movement. In his view, the mass strike debate was only the outward theoretical expression of a fundamental struggle between opposing forces within the socialist movement. In seeking to locate both the material and spiritual sources of these opposing forces, Pannekoek argued that the continuing commitment to parliamentary and trade union tactics by Kautsky and others was rooted in the very structure of the social democratic movement itself. Let me repeat that sentence. In seeking to locate both the material and spiritual sources of these opposing forces, Pannekoek argued that the continuing commitment to parliamentary and trade union tactics by Kautsky and others was rooted in the very structure of the social democratic movement itself, in its, quote, bloated bureaucratic apparatus, unquote, and representative leaders whose positions and power were directly tied to the old doctrines and tactics. But Pannekoek felt that during periods of social upheaval, the power of this group would dissipate rapidly as perceptions changed swiftly, and the, quote, constraining power of tradition, and, quote, loses its force. Quote, during a revolutionary epoch, when relationships are in constant flux, there arise completely new experiences which bring new thoughts to the mind, which then begin to clarify what have hitherto been only hazy presentiments. From these new experiences, the conclusions that are to be employed at the following struggles may be drawn, unquote. Pannekoek maintained that in these circumstances, only the masses could feel the compelling necessity of the new situation, since their position and perceptions were the least tied to the old doctrines and tactics. The tactical debate was brought to a new pitch of intensity by the following year when Kautsky launched another offensive against the left radicals in the form of a serialized Neue Zeit article entitled Die Aktion der Masse, Action by the Masses. Kautsky's aim was to provide a more comprehensive theoretical justification for his position by grounding it in a broad and detailed social and historical analysis of the role of mass actions in social development. While admitting that spontaneous street actions by the masses had often been a decisive revolutionary factor throughout history, Kautsky pointed out that such actions often served reactionary ends as well. In any case, Kautsky felt these forms of intervention had been largely superseded by the newer and more highly developed forms of activity embodied in the party and trade unions. It was at this point that Pannekoek, following an extended critique of Kautsky's position in his correspondence articles, proposed to Kautsky that they detail their different conceptions in a comprehensive and systematic manner in the Neue Zeit as a means of theoretical clarification. What inspired Pannekoek was his belief that the Neue Zeit was failing in its mission of clarifying issues and deepening and proving insights. His deep concern was that the socialist movement develop a proper understanding of the new phenomena of mass action and imperialism as a prelude to a major strategic and, quote, spiritual reorientation. In order not to give Kautsky a pretext for rejecting the proposal, Pannekoek suggested that a debate take place after the elections. Even before the debate could begin, however, the theoretical tactical controversy became interwoven with a conflict of more personal nature, which threatened to destroy the remaining bonds of friendship between Pannekoek and Kautsky. During the winter of 1911, the secretary of the editorial board of Neue Zeit, Gustav Eckstein, rejected one of Pannekoek's regular book review columns on the grounds that it could be used by the opponents of the party in the elections. Pannekoek, mindful of the similar effort to censor Rosa Luxemburg 2 years earlier, suspected that Kautsky might have been involved in the decision and wrote him a blistering letter that threatened to seize his collaboration on the Neue Zeit. This incident he charged was, quote, not accidental, unquote, but, quote, a symptom that on important basic questions we are now completely opposed to each other, end quote. Pannekoek. The Pannekoek-Kautsky debate itself began in July 1912 with the publication of Pannekoek's essay titled Massenaction und Revolution, Mass Action and Revolution, which was intended as a reply to Kautsky's article Die Action der Masse. In the course of his essay, Pannekoek outlined the basic components of his newly developed theory of mass action. What Pannekoek envisioned was a continuous and expanding series of mass actions ranging from ordinary street demonstrations to the general strike. These actions would serve to educate, collectivize, and strengthen the proletariat for the coming struggle for power, while simultaneously weakening the foundations of the capitalist state. In Pannekoek's view, the main rationale for these actions lay not in their objective aims, but in their subjective impact on the consciousness of the working class. The end of this process, he felt, would be, quote, nothing less than the complete transformation of the proletarian mentality, end quote. In emphasizing the internal dynamic of mass mobilization against Kautsky's attitude of, quote, passive expectation, end quote, Pannekoek argued explicitly that given the aggressive character of imperialism, the proletariat had no choice but to defend itself by a direct assault on the power instruments of capitalism. Once again, Pannekoek stressed, as he had in 1910, the necessity of the ultimate destruction of the capitalist state by the power instruments of the proletariat. Quote, it must be beaten, its power must be broken. Its power must be broken, end quote. It was precisely this emphasis that later prompted Lenin in 1917 to devote a major portion of State and Revolution to the Pannekoek-Kautsky controversy. Kautsky responded to Pannekoek's criticisms with an article entitled Die Neue Taktik, the New Tactic, in which he reproached Pannekoek for, quote, simplifying Marxism, end quote, and, quote, spiritualizing organization, end quote. Pannekoek's claim that the essence of proletarian organization lay in its subjective and spiritual qualities, Kautsky contended was a, quote, masterstroke of social alchemy, end quote. Kautsky took special pains to attack Pannekoek's call for the destruction of state power, maintaining that it was not based on an analysis of, quote, concrete relationships with real states, end quote, but on simplistic speculations about abstractions, end quote. The real task of the proletariat, Kautsky maintained, was to form a government responsive to its needs and interests by winning a majority in parliament. Kautsky felt that mass action could be justified, quote, only in occasional extreme instances when the masses no longer can be held back, end quote. Kautsky. Pannekoek, he charged, in extolling the dynamic of mass struggles, failed to understand that the goal of the workers' movement was not struggle in itself, but specific results. The indiscriminate use of struggle would not lead to ever greater strength, but to exhaustion and decomposition of the movement. Kautsky, noting that Marx once used the term, quote, parliamentary cretinism, end quote, to denigrate over-reliance on parliamentarism, concluded his remarks by suggesting that the terms, quote, mass action cretinism, end quote, might well be applied to Pannekoek's overemphasis on mass action. Pannekoek, hoping to influence the upcoming party congress, first took up Kautsky's argument in a series of articles in the Bremer Bürger Zeitung and Leipziger Volkszeitung, and expanded upon these thoughts several weeks later in a Neue Zeit article entitled Marxist Theory and Revolutionary Tactics. In this essay, Pannekoek placed the question of Kautsky's methodology squarely in the forefront of the discussion, when he accused him of using, quote, un-Marxist reasoning, end quote, to conclude that the masses were unstable and unpredictable. But Pannekoek went a step further and attempted to pinpoint the social and cognitive source of this error rather than attribute it to personal failure or dishonesty on Kautsky's part. He attributed his differences with Kautsky to a difference in perception based upon different experiences and different stages of the workers' movement. Pannekoek's point of departure was his belief that Marxism was composed of both determinist and activist elements, each of which have received different degrees of emphasis in different historical periods. During the early phase of industrialization, where socialists were confronted with the task of organizing the proletariat and preventing premature putsches, Marxism took on a predominantly historical economic character as a means of giving the movement self-confidence and a long-range justification. But as the proletariat became better organized and more capable of active intervention in social life, Marxism was increasingly seen as a theory of proletarian action. The conclusion Pannekoek drew from this was that Kautsky's perspective was derived from conceptions formed during the early stages of the workers' movement, which accounted for his fear of defeat and emphasis on self-restraint. Pannekoek felt that his own position reflected the sentiments of a younger generation of workers whose conceptions had been forged during the mass struggle of the preceding decade. Kautsky, less reserved in his judgments, responded by accusing Pannekoek of advocating, quote, syndicalist conceptions, end quote. His sharpest reaction, however, was reserved for Pannekoek's emphasis on the destruction of the capitalist state. Quote, up till now, he wrote, quote, the difference between social democrats and anarchists has consisted in the fact that the former wanted to conquer state power, while the latter wanted to destroy it. Pannekoek wants to do both, end quote. Kautsky continued by citing numerous quotations from Marx and Engels to prove his point that state power was as much a mechanism for dispossession of ruling classes as it was one of class domination. To this argument, Kautsky added, quote, perhaps Pannekoek wants to abolish the state function of the officials, end quote. So I don't know why I said, end quote. Let me repeat that. To this argument, Kautsky added, quote, perhaps Pannekoek wants to abolish the state function of the officials, but we cannot do without officials even in the party and trade union organizations, much less in the state administration. Our program demands not abolition of state officials, but their election by the people, end quote. As a final rebuke, he suggested, quote, I strongly suspect that Pannekoek is gathering material for a book whose title will be Mass Action by Isolated Men, end quote. Kautsky. The debate was brought to a close with a short rejoinder by Pannekoek in which he accused Kautsky of substituting name-calling for discussion of the issues. To Kautsky's charges of syndicalism, Pannekoek retorted, quote, if he is correct that these views are syndicalist, then so much the better for syndicalism, end quote. Beyond this, Pannekoek pointed out that Kautsky's extensive use of quotations from Marx and Engels revealed the basic contrast between their methodologies. Quote, I have almost no citations of Marx and Engels because those who have completely absorbed this new science, which they brought to us, do not need to continually prove that they are following in their footsteps with citations from their work. There is nothing better he could have done to highlight the differences in our method and views, end quote. Pannekoek. Such an approach, he felt, was the, quote, direct opposite of Marxism. New section. Militants against the apparatus. The Bremen left. Pannekoek's break with the theory and practice of official social democracy corresponded to, and was greatly reinforced by, his move to the heavily industrialized city of Bremen in the spring of 1910 to organize and teach in a local SPD school. In contrast to his years in Berlin, Pannekoek was fully immersed in the active life of the party as a teacher, propagandist, and leader. During this period, Pannekoek was probably more intimately involved in the everyday life of the workers than at any other time in his political life. Pannekoek's 4 years within the organizational framework of Bremen social democracy provided a fertile ground for the elaboration of his own thought and were among the most vital and productive of his life. In Bremen, Pannekoek found himself within a bastion of the German left, to whose inchoate radicalism he helped to give a coherent structure. During the years which followed, Pannekoek was to exercise, through his contact with both the membership and the functionaries, a decisive influence on the development of Bremen social democracy. As a result of Pannekoek's extensive organizational and ideological work, the Bremen left emerged as the, quote, best anchor grouping of the extreme left wing of the Social Democratic Party, end quote. The nature of the local economy had a powerful conditioning effect upon the development of a left-wing social democratic movement in Bremen. During the period 1890 to 1910, Bremen experienced a rapid process of industrialization and urban growth, which transformed the city from a commercial center into a stormy industrial metropolis. Between 1888 and 1907, the number of industrial workers increased fourfold, from 8,463 to 33,825. Economic growth from the mid-1890s onward was concentrated largely in the technologically advanced and highly concentrated shipbuilding industry, which swiftly became the mainstay of the city's economy. In 1895, this sector of the economy ranked 7th with 849 workers. By 1907, it had reached second place with 5,633 workers, a rise of 563.5%. Only the building trades, which owed much of their prosperity of the rise of this industry, counted more workers. The growth of the shipbuilding industry acted as a further stimulus to growth in several other advanced industries. Between 1888 and 1907, the number of workers employed in metal processing rose from 2,381 to 3,465, or 45.5%. In textiles, from 1,304 to 2,073, or 58.9%. In the printing trades, from 748 to 1,059, or 41.6%. Economic growth was also reflected in the highly concentrated nature of capitalist enterprises in Bremen. In 1907, 66.3% of the workforce in the shipbuilding and machine-building industries worked in shops with more than 200 workers, 13.1% in shops and 51 to 200 workers, 12.1% in shops and 11 to 50 workers, and only 8.5% in shops with less than 10 workers. 2 shipyards alone accounted for 3,830 workers. The working class itself was dominated largely by semi-skilled male workers, most of whom had migrated to Bremen from elsewhere and had little in the way of a craft union tradition to draw upon. By 1907, 57.5% of the workforce had been born elsewhere. A further factor defining the socio-economic character of Bremen was the low standard of living of its working class. In 1906, the aggregate income of the Bremen working class, which constituted 2/3 of the population, was 20 million marks less than the aggregate income of the wealthiest 2.6% of the population. Taken together, these socio-economic factors combined to create an unintegrated, volatile, and permanently aggrieved workforce whose inchoate radicalism profoundly shaped the course of Bremen's social democracy. Until 1903, the socialist movement in Bremen was dominated by a reformist group led by Friedrich Ebert, which had its base in the craft unions. Throughout 1903 and 1904, internal tensions within the party built up rapidly, resulting in the crystallization of separate reformist and radical Marxist factions. This train of development began in October 1902 when Heinrich Schultz became editor-in-chief of the Bremen Bürger Zeitung, which gave the left a powerful mechanism for defining the political direction of the movement. A former teacher whose Marxism was shaped largely by ethical and humanitarian considerations, Heinrich Schultz had been a long-standing opponent of the traditional line of Bremen social democracy. Heinrich Schultz's principal collaborator on the Bürger Zeitung was Alfred Henke, a genial former cigar maker who personified the self-educated worker intellectual of the turn of the century. Through his weekly, titled From the Factory column, Henke sought to inculcate a radical Marxist spirit within the membership. Schulz's first opportunity to promote a radical Marxist tactic came during the 1903 Reichstag elections, when the campaigns in the Bürger Zeitung against a proposed SPD alliance with the Liberals. When the election unexpectedly resulted in the victory of the SPD candidate, it greatly strengthened his position. A second issue of demarcation arose in the fall of 1903 over the question of how to locally implement the condemnation of revisionism that had been pronounced at the Congress of Dresden. By January 1905, it was becoming clear that the radicals were gaining the upper hand when the reformists suffered a major defeat over the question of continued SPD participation in a liberal educational society, the Goethebund, following a long campaign against it by Schulz in the Bürger Zeitung. It was this defeat which prompted Ebert to leave for Berlin to work in the party secretariat. These issues, however, were dwarfed by the mass strike debate of the summer of 1905, in which the left's position prevailed completely. While these controversies were significant in defining the radical position, they were not decisive in the consolidation of a radical majority. What was crucial was the left's growing influence in a number of key institutions of Bremen's social democracy. Next to their control of the Bürger Zeitung, the left's main source of influence was in a local secretariat which had been created in May 1906 to administer the day-to-day affairs of the party. Under the control of the radical carpenter, Wilhelm Pieck, the secretariat played a theoretical role in undermining the influence of the craft union leadership in the party. An indefatigable organizer who combined the qualities of a bureaucrat and an agitator, Pieck almost single-handedly built up a strong base for the radicals in the industrial districts of Bremen. Within a few weeks of taking office, Pieck had increased party membership from 3,912 to 5,610. In the ensuing tactical debates, the Pieck organizational skills played an indispensable role in confirming the line of the radicals among the rank and file. A third source of radical influence lay in the local SPD's extensive educational program, which the left had developed to radicalize rank-and-file trade union militants. This program began in the fall of 1905 with the formation of a workers' educational committee, which sponsored a series of forums and lectures. To a large extent, this committee was an outgrowth of the debate earlier that year over participation in the liberal Goethebund, which led many to see the need for a form of workers' education separate from bourgeois education. A proposal to establish a more formalized structure with a paid permanent instructor, however, was vetoed for the time being by the trade union leadership. The impetus for much of this emphasis on education came from a group of socialist educators organized within the Teachers' Society who were among the most prominent and influential activists of the left. In firm control of the Bürger Zeitung, the Secretariat, and the party's local educational program, the left was by 1906 in a position to disseminate its radical conception of Marxism to the rapidly growing membership. Their position was also greatly enhanced by the long-standing practice of holding regular general membership meetings of all the local sections of which major political questions were discussed and debated. It was these forums above all else which ensured that the radicals retained the confidence of the membership. The first major opportunity to translate their views into action came in March 1908, when spontaneous street demonstrations over the suffrage question erupted in Bremen for the first time. During the course of the next few months, the radicals pursued a long and intense agitational campaign in the Bürger Zeitung and in mass membership meetings for the use of the mass strike and other extra-parliamentary methods. Throughout 1908 and 1909, this issue became interwoven with a growing criticism of the national SPD leadership. By September 1909, the Bürger Zeitung was prepared to assert that only the, quote, energy of the masses, unquote, and the elan of a revolutionary mass movement could animate social democracy with the new spirit necessary for its revitalization. On the basis of this perspective, it was clear by the fall of 1909 that the majority of the Bremen movement was already in what would later be termed the left radical camp. Sensing the imminence of a new epoch of revolutionary struggles, the left resurrected its long-standing plan for a permanent joint educational program with the trade unions. When this proposal was proved in late 1909, Wilhelm Pieck conveyed to Pannekoek an offer to organize the program and serve as a, quote, scientific instructor, unquote. Although Pannekoek had turned down a similar offer in 1907, his growing dissatisfaction with his work in Berlin now led him to readily accept. For Pannekoek, this appointment marked the culmination of a long informal relationship with Bremen social democracy. His first contact with the movement came in September 1905, when at Schulz's invitation he came to lecture on religion and socialism. This relationship was deepened the following year when he taught with Schulz in the SPD Central Party School. During the course of the next few years, the Bürger Zeitung became one of the most regular outlets for his theoretical writings, which in turn played a critical role in defining the political perspective of Bremen social democracy. Pannekoek's appointment provoked heated opposition from the trade union functionaries, who feared it would strengthen the position of the radicals. Since the unions were responsible for 1,500 marks of Pannekoek's 4,000 mark salary, their support was essential. The issue was finally resolved, however, only by taking it directly to the trade union membership. 23 unions and 12,844 members voted to confirm Pannekoek as opposed to 12 unions and 8,362 members against his opponents. Against his appointment. Excuse me. In setting up the party school, Pannekoek emphasized the importance of developing a radical pedagogy as part of the process of, quote, spiritual liberation, required by the new epoch of mass actions. A properly conducted proletarian education, Pannekoek felt, would help lay the groundwork for the emergence of a new type of party and trade union official who would no longer be tied to, quote, a corrupt bureaucratic system, end quote. One second. Sorry, and this is annoying. Computer stuff. Sorry about that. In structuring his coursework, which was centered around social theory and the history of the workers' movement, Pannekoek attempted to develop a more popularized version of the material he had used in the Central Party School. This task was not without its difficulties. Quote, everything must be newly developed, built up and sustained, and, quote, he complained to Peake, quote, without textbooks, models, or methods, or extracted from abstract scientific works and popularized, end quote. Pannekoek. Because of the elementary nature of much of the material, he felt, quote, more like a schoolmaster than a scientist, end quote. Pannekoek. Pannekoek's courses, which were always coordinated with a variety of practical activities, were held at night to audiences of rank-and-file trade unionists. During the turbulent political struggles of the next decade, the group of several hundred former students played a key role in defining the political direction of the Marxist left in Bremen. In the formulation of the basic strategic perspective of the Bremen left, Pannekoek was joined by two other key activists, Karl Radek and Johann Johann Knief. Karl Radek, who played a role second only to Pannekoek in the theoretical development of Bremen left radicalism, was a Polish-born activist who had a long career in the Russian, Polish, and German social democratic parties. Thin, small, and nervous with an often vitriolic temperament, Radek combined broad knowledge with a sarcastic wit. Radek's special talents lay in journalism, which found expression in countless articles for the Bürger Zeitung. His contacts with the left elsewhere in Germany and abroad were to play a crucial role in cementing a network of the left. Being also of Polish extraction, believe it. Didn't it say? Rosa Luxemburg hated Karl Radek. And if you read some of the stuff from within the Council Communist tradition, from Hermann Gorder about his trip to Moscow when the Communist Workers' Party was still seeking some kind of affiliation to the third the German Communist Workers' Party of Germany was still seeking some type of affiliation to the Third International. He went to Moscow, and I feel like if my memory serves me correct, his discussion, whenever he spoke of Radek, it was extreme vitriol. Anyway, Radek's special talent lay in journalism, which found expression in countless articles for the Berger Zeitung. His contacts with the left elsewhere in Germany and abroad were to play a crucial role in cementing a network of the left. I also believe, I can't remember what it's from, where I heard this, and it is speculation, I'm pretty sure, that some people speculate, or have speculated, that Radek in some sense was responsible for the death of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. But I'm not sure. Anyway, Johann Knief, by contrast, had been a long-standing activist within Bremen social democracy. A teacher from a working-class background and a talented musician, Johann Knief combined an introverted and at times melancholy temperament with qualities of absolute sincerity and firm dedication to principles. Knief's earliest activities were in the Teachers' Society, where he emerged in 1909 as the leader of the Social Democratic faction. During that same year, he attempted to develop a, quote, section for scientific socialism within the society in order to further an understanding of socialism among Bremen teachers. Knief's original intention had been to recruit Pannekoek to organize and direct this program, but his project failed to materialize. Knief first began to write for the Berger Zeitung as a music critic in 1910, and within a year rose to political editor. Of all Pannekoek's friendships in Bremen, none was more important or closer than his relationship with Johann Knief. During Pannekoek's 4 years in Bremen, Knief was a regular dinner guest at the Pannekoek household, where he often joined Pannekoek's wife Anna in playing duets on the piano. Politically, Pannekoek and Knief maintained a, quote, teacher-pupil relationship. Knief later acknowledged that Pannekoek had been the major political influence on his life. The significance of Pannekoek, Knief, and Radek for the theoretical development of the Bremen left became readily apparent in the political controversies which occurred in 1910. In the months prior to Pannekoek's arrival in 1910, the Bremen movement was caught up in the excitement generated by the Prussian suffrage demonstrations. The Berger Zeitung set the tone by proclaiming the demonstrations the, quote, beginning of the German Revolution, in quote, in a front-page editorial. The suffrage question, however, soon became interwoven with a local issue involving the dismissal of a socialist teacher who was also a leader of the Teachers' Society. The Bremen SPD responded swiftly by organizing mass demonstrations which continued throughout March and April, on occasion ending in clashes with the police. The largest of these was held on March 14th and involved 12,000 persons. These actions were followed by a lengthy discussion of the question of mass action in the Berger Zeitung and in membership meetings throughout the spring and summer of 1910, with Pannekoek's evolving formulations defining the parameters of the debate. By the time of the Congress of Magdeburg in September 1910, the Bremen SPD had developed into the leading proponent of mass action within the SPD. Shortly before the Congress opened, the Bremen delegates took the initiative and organized a caucus of the left which found expression in a resolution drafted by Pannekoek and Rosa Luxemburg and later signed by 62 delegates, calling for, quote, bold and thorough mass action for the working population, using every means available, including the mass strike, end quote. The growing antipathy of Pannekoek and the Bremen left toward the traditional forms of working-class organization was heightened by a prolonged dispute with both the national and local trade union leadership. Pannekoek defined the parameters of this conflict shortly before he arrived in Bremen in an article titled Unteroffiziere, Non-Commissioned Officers, which he characterized the struggle between leaders and rank and file in the trade union movement as, quote, irreconcilable opposition between revolution and authority, between subversion and order, end quote. Pannekoek. Drawing upon military metaphors, Pannekoek advanced the proposition that the trade union bureaucracy represented a key consolidating agent of capitalism. Quote, There is a contrast between the masses and their leaders. The Social Democratic non-commissioned officers do what the Prussian non-commissioned officers cannot do. They quiet the unruly masses, accustom them to discipline and divert them from revolution, end quote. Pannekoek argued that this, quote, corruption of the movement, end quote, represented the, quote, main hope of the bourgeoisie. Pannekoek's accusations unleashed a storm of protest in the trade union movement. The main point of contention involved Pannekoek's use of the phrase, quote, non-commissioned officers, end quote, a term that was particularly insulting in working-class circles since many workers, while in the army, had been subjected to abuse by non-commissioned officers. In the end, Pannekoek was forced to back down and admit that the phrase was ill-chosen. Pannekoek's critique of the trade union bureaucracy was given added credence by a series of events which occurred during the course of a bitter 3-month-long dock and shipyard workers' strike in the fall of 1910. The strike itself began as a response to a lockout in Hamburg, but its origins were traceable to several years of progressively deteriorating work conditions in the shipyards, involving wage cuts, lengthening of the working day, and speed-ups, which were a response to growing foreign competition in the shipbuilding industry. Although the Bremen trade union leadership tried in vain to prevent this strike from spreading to Bremen, the pent-up resentment of the workers could not be held in check, and strike fever spread rapidly throughout the shipyards. Almost immediately, a major conflict developed between the leadership and the rank and file over how vigorously to pursue the strike. The aggressive militancy of the rank and file, however, failed to affect the union leadership's conduct of the strike. Following 3 months of hard struggle, the executive of the Metal Workers Union moved to end the strike on terms unfavorable to the workers. This decision unleashed a storm of protest from the rank and file. In Bremen, a mass meeting of the Metal Workers Union held to vote on the agreement turned into a violent confrontation between strikers and union officials, forcing the leadership to call an abrupt halt to the proceedings. That when another meeting was held several days later, the agreement was rejected by a vote of 1,748 to 1,177. Although the agreement was eventually pushed through by the executive, it left discontent smoldering in the rank and file. From a political standpoint, the strike experiences both helped solidify the ties between the radical SPD leadership and the local working class, and continue to serve as a special ideological reference point for the organizational politics of Bremen left radicalism. When the executive of the Metal Workers Union later attempted to defend their policies at a public forum by charging that the rank and file were, quote, capricious, unreliable, and incapable of making important decisions, end quote, Pannekoek responded with another prominent article entitled Gewerkschaftliche Demokratie, Trade Union Democracy. Pannekoek now argued that the trade unions had taken on the characteristics of the capitalist structures to which they were nominally opposed. They had become large-scale, hierarchical, highly organized, and rigidly disciplined bodies with their own character, mentality, and traditions. In terms of income, status, lifestyle, and modes of reasoning, the union executives often had more in common with the capitalist managers than with the rank-and-file workers. They had become a body with a will to live and fight for their own interests, which were separate from those of the workers. Pannekoek felt that because of this trade union bureaucracy induced a psychology of passivity and deference to authority among the workers. Instead of instilling class consciousness, the union leaders perpetuated a form of consciousness that bound the workers to the capitalist order. This line of argument drove Pannekoek to the conclusion that cleavages of the type which had emerged between leaders and rank and file during the shipyard strike were both, quote, inevitable and necessary, end quote. To help democratize the movement, Pannekoek drafted a proposal calling for the formation of independent shop floor organizations chosen directly from the workers themselves, which would be able to convey the mood and will of the masses and, quote, form the ideal organs to lead and build the political mass strikes, end quote. Although Pannekoek did not at this point use the term, quote, workers' councils, the elements of council organization were clearly present in embryonic form in this proposal. Once again, Pannekoek's comments aroused the wrath of the German trade union leadership, who responded with a series of blistering personal attacks. Typical were the remarks in the official publication of the General Commission of General Trade Unions, charging him with living in a, quote, aristocratic quarter and, quote, of Bremen under circumstances which no worker could ever hope to attain. The high point of this controversy came in March 1911 when Pannekoek debated the German trade union leader Karl Leiden before an audience of 3,000 to 4,000 in Hamburg. Pannekoek followed this up with a speaking tour of various parts of Germany to defend his position before trade union audiences. In Bremen, Pannekoek's conflict with the trade union leadership became tied in a direct clash of organizational power when the local trade union leaders attempted to organize a boycott of his courses and deny union funding of his salary. Throughout March and April 1911, the Bremen left and the trade union leaders held a series of public discussions in an attempt to resolve their differences. These meetings, however, turned out to be more tumultuous than conciliatory, often, as Henke noted, taking on the character of a, quote, cockfight between Pannekoek and some of the trade union representatives, end quote. The conflict was temporarily diffused when Pannekoek agreed to have his course load reduced in return for a withdrawal of union financing. The issues posed by the controversy were revived with even greater intensity during the course of a second shipyard workers' strike in July and August of 1913. In contrast to the earlier strike, this one was a wildcat strike organized and conducted expressly against the wishes of union leadership. Once again, the strike was precipitated by events in Hamburg, where 18,000 shipyard workers spontaneously walked off their jobs to protest their employer's refusal to negotiate. Almost immediately, the strike spread to Bremen, where 3,000 shipyard workers walked off their jobs without authorization from their organizations and held a mass meeting demanding that the strike be officially sanctioned. The strikers were soon joined by the local woodworkers' union. Within a few days, over 9,000 workers were on strike in Bremen. The trade union leadership, however, continued to deny the strike official recognition, leaving the strikers to the mercy of the employer's strike-breaking tactics. When the union leaders began to invoke disciplinary measures against the strikers, they had little choice but to yield. The final result was that several thousand of the most militant workers were blacklisted from their jobs. While these events were in progress, Pannekoek set himself the task of providing a more solid, theoretical justification for the strike actions. In his opinion, the wildcat strike tactic represented a, quote, small-scale revolution and the essence of the proletarian struggle in the epoch of imperialism. The tactical conclusion that Pannekoek drew from the strike was that traditional trade union discipline could only be used to limit the mass struggles of the future. The conditions for victory, on the other hand, required the very qualities that the leaders sought to suppress in the masses: their revolutionary energy, solidarity, and willingness for self-sacrifice. Although the tide of events turned against the strikers, their experiences only confirmed for many Bremen workers the organizational critique which Pannekoek and the left radicals had been articulating since at least 1908. The prevailing view of many was summed up by a resolution which was overwhelmingly accepted by a vote of 432 to 45 at a membership meeting of the Bremen Woodworkers Union. The last of the striking unions to return to work, quote, "It is not our belief that the strike is lost that has compelled us to take this action, return to work, but the callow bureaucratization of our executive, which has defeated every effort of support. We strikers are of the opinion that if the executive had been willing to aid the struggle, our opponents would have been defeated. It was not our opponents who defeated us, but our own organization and the short-sightedness of our executive," end quote. Paul Dittmann, one of the strike leaders in Hamburg, bitterly noted that the day would come when the workers would, quote, settle with the central bureaucracy, end quote. As events pushed their theoretical development forward, Pannekoek and the Bremen left began to increasingly turn their attention to influencing national party policy. Throughout the spring and summer of 1912, the Bremen left focused much of their energies on developing a comprehensive policy of organizational reform for the SPD to be presented at the Congress of Chemnitz. In July, a proposal by Pannekoek was approved, which called for the formation of two advisory bodies independent of the party leadership. One, a purely theoretical body, was to be composed of the, quote, best political minds of the party, end quote, who would devote their time to analyzing the major political questions of the day. This body was to be supplemented by an organizational council composed of representatives from the large cities and industrial districts who would advise the executive on the mood of the masses.
At Chemnitz, Pannekoek's proposal for party reform became closely linked to resolutions on imperialism and armaments limitations. As the main spokesman of the Bremen left, Pannekoek defended with relentless efficiency the left radical position that imperial and armaments production would inevitably lead to war and could be effectively combated only by revolutionary mass actions. He argued that it would be a grave error for the SPD to attempt to ally with the hypothetical anti-imperialist tendencies among certain sectors of the bourgeoisie. In the end, the left suffered another defeat when the Congress overwhelmingly approved a resolution submitted by the executive declaring that the dangerous effects of imperialism could be mitigated only through arms accords and free trade. For Pannekoek, the events of Chemnitz, I don't know how to say that. I don't know how to say it. Anyway, I'll just say Chemnitz. No, it would be Chemnitz, right? I don't know. Chemnitz only confirmed his view that the Marxist center was abandoning Marxist tactics and uniting with the revisionists to form a, quote, gigantic kind of reformism, end quote. Chemnitz, he argued, only the preliminary stage of a, quote, deep spiritual struggle, end quote, which would eventually be paralleled by a direct struggle against the party apparatus, strengthened by the decisions of Chemnitz. I don't know how to say that. Fuck. Wait, I have internet access right now.
Chemnitz.
I was right. Chemnitz. I don't even need to do that fucking, like, hawking a loogie sound. Anyway, where the hell am I? Chemnitz, he argued, marked only the preliminary stage of a, quote, deep spiritual struggle, which would eventually be paralleled by a direct struggle against the party apparatus. Strengthened by the decisions of Chemnitz and by the emergence of a new centrist faction in Bremen, the local reformists took the opportunity to mount a 2-month-long offensive against the left. Since Pannekoek had emerged as the leading spokesman of the left, the reformists attacked him with particular vehemence, terming him a, quote, syndicalist and a, quote, great worshipper of the masses, end quote. A campaign to have Pannekoek expelled, however, drew virtually no support. The debate over armaments and imperialism resumed with new fervor at the Congress of Jena in September 1913. At the Congress, Pannekoek and the Bremen delegation joined forces with Rosa Luxemburg and other left groups to present sharply worded resolutions opposing the party's recent support for the military budget and reaffirming the use of the mass strike and other offensive tactics. In contrast to Chemnitz, however, this Congress was marked by significant gains for the left radicals, who managed to obtain about 30% of the vote. Pannekoek, in his post-Congress summary of the events of Jena, now felt optimistic enough to assert that the left radicals had become a decisive minority, quote, bringing to expression the driving spirit of the masses, end quote. Pannekoek. By the eve of the First World War, it was clear that Pannekoek and the Bremen left radicals had embarked on a course markedly different from that of the SPD majority. The intersection of Pannekoek's theoretical reflections with the concrete political experiences and active political struggles of the Bremen left radicals and the local working class combined to create a distinctive radical consciousness and movement. The radicalism of the Bremen left stressed that the limits of the traditional preliminary and trade union tactics could be transcended only by radical tactics, by the use of the mass strike, reliance on rank-and-file initiative, and by the formation of new structures of proletarian power. The strength of the left radicals lay not in their numbers, but in the effectiveness of their political leadership, the clarity of their political analysis and goals, and in the intensive dedication of an activist cadre. Their agitation helped galvanize the aggressively dissatisfied part of the working class, whose actions seemed to confirm the left's radical political perspective. Knief summed up this situation when he observed that, quote, our threads to the organization are becoming looser and looser, ... and our connection with the mother body increasingly lost, end quote. Knief. New section, quote, sect or party, end quote. The Dutch SPD. While these developments were unfolding within German social democracy, a similar process of political differentiation was already well underway in Holland. Pannekoek, although in Germany, continued to be closely connected to those events and displayed a major role in placing them in theoretical focus. Forced out of the SDAP by events at Deventer and the Tribunist opposition gathered in Amsterdam on March 14, 1909, to formally proclaim the Social-Democratische Party, SPD, local Social Democratic Party. The prevailing mood was one of exuberant optimism. The shared assumption was that the workers of the large industrial centers, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and the Twente Exile District, could rally to them on the basis of their intransigent Marxist propaganda. Jan Setten captured this buoyant sense of a new beginning when he observed, quote, "The workers await us. ... If we delay, they will no longer listen to us," end quote. As a theoretical starting point, the SDP adopted an orthodox Marxist program identical to that of the SDAP, which they claimed the Troelstra leadership had violated. Gorter declared in a passionate address that whereas the SDAP was like, quote, a ship without a rudder, end quote, the SPD would remain, quote, firm and unshakable, convinced of the truth of our principles, end quote. The actual number affiliating with the SDP, however, fell far short of expectations. Only about 400 persons, about 5% of the total membership, left the SDAP to join the new party. These included 160 from Amsterdam, 65 from Rotterdam, 56 from Leiden, and 25 from Utrecht. The optimism of its leaders notwithstanding, the SDP emerged from its first Congress under conditions of considerable uncertainty and confusion. For several months, the split was far from definitive as groups in both parties continued to work for reunification. These efforts were led primarily by members of the now divided Nieuwe Tijd group. Of this group, Pannekoek, Gorter, and Wiedijk affiliated with the new party, while Rolandholst, Van der Goes, and Wieboud remained in the SDAP. Henrietta Rolandholst's support for the SDAP, however, was still highly qualified at this point. In early March, Henrietta Rolandholst addressed a letter to the SDAP executive which noted her, quote, inner agreement, end quote, with the new party and warned that in the event of any further attempts to restrict freedom of expression, she too would withdraw. Rolandholst followed this up with a lengthy appeal in the Nieuwe Tijd, which was unaffected by the split, for both parties to attempt to work out their differences. The first significant step toward a compromise was taken when Rolandholst and Wieboud appealed to the International Socialist Bureau to mediate the dispute. On March 10, 1909, Gorter and Winkoop met in Brussels with the Belgian leaders of the ISB, Van der Velte, Anzela, and Huysmans. The Belgians formulated a three-point proposal which called for the abolition of the Tribuna, a guarantee of freedom of expression for the Marxist minority, and the addition of an editor from the Tribuna to the new weekly Marxist supplement to Het Volk. While the SDAP agreed to accept the proposal, the SDP rejected it. Within the SDP executive, Gorter and Mendels favored accepting the proposal, while Winkoop, Setten, Van Ravenstein, and two others were opposed. This decision was subsequently ratified by the membership by a vote of 257 to 135. In protest, Mendels resigned to rejoin the SDAP, while Gorter seriously considered doing so. Gorter delineated his own reservations sharply when he noted to Pannekoek, quote, Winkoop and Van Ravenstein did not want a compromise. They were so absorbed in the thought of their own party with themselves as leaders that they no longer wanted to remain in the old organization, Winkoop is someone who sees two ways to reach a goal, a right way and a wrong way, and always chooses the wrong way because he doesn't trust the right way, end quote. Gorder. The new party began life on the defensive, the product as much of expulsion as the search for an independent path. During the first year of its existence, the SDP was guided largely by the principles which had characterized the Tribuna from its inception, those of a militant, intransigent, activist Marxism. Although the day-to-day leadership of the new party rested with Wynkoop, Van Ravestein, and Setten, Pannekoek and Gorder played a prominent role in the initial formulation and dissemination of the SPD's ideology. Despite their initial hesitation, both Gorder and Pannekoek soon began to support the new party with full enthusiasm. Pannekoek summed up his new attitude in a letter to Rolandholst. Quote, "What we earlier saw as a defeat, we now see differently. Now that everything is behind us, it appears as something completely natural and logical that could have developed in no other way. What we once perceived as a disaster, and which brought with it suffering and struggle, now represents liberation," end quote. Pannekoek. At Gorder's request, Pannekoek journeyed to Bussum to help draft brochures and other documents for the new party. Following his return to Germany, Pannekoek began a campaign to promote the Tribunist cause within German social democracy. The first test of the SDP's strength came in the June 1909 election in 3 districts, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Leiden, where the party ran legislative candidates. The result was a stunning defeat. Despite an extensive propaganda campaign, the SDP received a combined total of only 542 votes, or about 1.5% of the total vote in each district. Even before the electoral campaign got underway, the SDP suffered a major loss when the majority of the Utrecht section and about 10 members of the Amsterdam section left to rejoin the SDAP. In assessing this defeat, Gorder attributed it to the average worker's lack of knowledge about socialism. Quote, "He thinks too much in terms of bourgeois-type politics. He thinks too little of his own politics, of his own power," end quote. Gorder. For this, Gorder's proposed remedy was only, quote, "propaganda and more propaganda," end quote. Gorder. Henrietta Rolandholst, noting that the SDAP had drawn 8,200 votes in the same districts, up from 6,500 in the previous election, viewed it as an argument for SDP members to return to the SDAP. With its membership base weak and its electoral prospects limited, the SDP's flagging optimism was sustained largely by the wave of mass actions which characterized the last years of the pre-war period. In the wake of the Prussian suffrage demonstrations of February 1910, Pannekoek's writings on mass action began to appear regularly in the Tribuna, so that under his influence the theory of mass action swiftly became the strategic cornerstone of Dutch left radicalism. The SDP's first attempt to intervene in a mass struggle came during a 4-month-long strike of Amsterdam construction workers in early 1910. Since the strikers were affiliated with the syndicalist NAS, both the SDAP and the NVV refused to support the strike. The SDP, however, immediately offered active material and moral support to the strikers and accused the SDAP and NVV of collusion with the employers. The strike also provoked a lengthy discussion in the SDP over what type of policy to maintain toward the trade union movement. Setten summed up what later became the SDP's official policy, when he argued that the SDAP had been captured by the trade union bureaucracy of the NVV and transformed into an organization concerned only with securing minor reforms beneficial to the trade unions. Only the NAS unions, he felt, were acting on the basis of the class struggle. What was increasingly becoming a de facto alliance between the SDP and the syndicalists was further cemented in the summer of 1911 when a bitter dock workers' strike broke out in the Amsterdam and Rotterdam harbors. The Amsterdam unions were affiliated with the NAS while the Rotterdam unions were affiliated with the NVV. The Rotterdam unions, however, quickly voted to accept the employer's offer and left the Amsterdam unions to continue the strike on their own. Several days later, the SDAP executive, over the objections of the remaining, quote, peace Marxists, voted to discontinue all support for the strike. As in the case of the construction workers' strike, the SDP immediately threw its full weight behind the strike. By now, the SDP leaders were willing to appear jointly with the syndicalist leaders at strike support meetings. When the strike was finally broken, following several bloody confrontations by government-protected strike breakers, the SDP accused the SDAP of sabotaging it. Within the SDAP, these events triggered a renewed internal crisis which appeared to offer new prospects for the SDP. At the 1912 SDAP Congress, the quote, peace Marxist attempted to censor the executive for refusing to support the striking syndicalist workers. When the censor motion failed, Henrietta Rolandholst and Henk Snevliet, chairman of the Dutch Union of Railway and Tram Personnel, resigned from the SDAP. Rolandholst, still harboring doubts about Wynkoop's personality and methods, agreed to refrain from joining the SDP. Snevliet, although sharing many of her reservations, nonetheless joined, becoming the first trade union leader of any consequence to affiliate with the new party. The SDP's alliance with the syndicalists was formalized as a cornerstone of party policy at the 1911 Congress of Rotterdam. Wynkoop, calling for a, quote, unity of struggle, and, quote, declared, quote, not only the SDP but also the syndicalists must become stronger, because the cooperation that is a necessary precondition for any meaningful kind of unity arises only out of strength, when there is no longer a possibility of being destroyed, end quote. In justifying this alliance, he argued that the syndicalist unions were qualitatively different from the, quote, bourgeois unions of the NVV because of their willingness to struggle. For many in the SDP, this alliance was viewed as the party's first major breakthrough. As Van Ravestein later noted, quote, it raised to a considerable extent the self-consciousness of the membership and the feeling of the indispensability of their organization, and earned them a certain name and reputation among the undoubtedly socialist-inclined, struggling workers who were adverse to politics but found their reference point in the syndicalist trade unions, end quote. The SDP's first attempt to use this alliance as a means of developing a base in the working class came in 1911, when it joined with the syndicalists to form a national agitation committee against the high cost of living. From a strategic standpoint, the SDP viewed this organization as a mechanism for channeling discontent over rising inflation into a mass movement. This committee, which was open to all organizations, quote, willing to act from the standpoint of a class struggle, end quote, was composed of representatives from the SDP, about a dozen anarchist and syndicalist organizations and unions. The committee's main function was to organize a series of local demonstrations leading up to a national demonstration on April 12, 1912. The results of these efforts, however, were usually meager. Despite an intensive propaganda campaign, only about 400 persons participated in the national demonstration. As the SDP continued to confront the realities of Dutch society, the bright hopes which had sustained morale through the reformative period increasingly gave way to an undercurrent of pessimism and self-doubt. A year after its formation, the SDP's membership had risen to only 505, and the new party was forced to admit that it still remained, quote, totally unknown, end quote, to the working class. By 1911, this figure stood at a mere 575, and the bitter reality was clear, quote, our small sections throughout the country have a difficult struggle ahead of them, end quote. A year later, the number had dropped to 511, and the party could only note, quote, struggle, struggle, and still more struggle. That must be our watchword, end quote. In 1913, the figure was 533. In 1914, 525. In 1913 alone, over 100 members left the party, mainly to rejoin the SDAP. More troubling still was the low circulation of the Tribuna, which had attained only 1,266 subscribers by 1914. Nor did the SDP show any improvement in the electoral arena. In the 1913 elections, the party drew only 1,340 votes in 18 districts, in contrast to 144,000 for the SDAP. Even Gorder fared poorly, obtaining only 196 votes, as opposed... where am I? Even Gorder fared poorly, obtaining only 196 votes, as opposed to the 5,325 for the SDAP candidate. These weaknesses were further compounded by the party's low proportion of working class members. Although the SDP's social composition remains difficult to gauge, it is clear that the, quote, pure proletarian, end quote, element represented a minority. A survey made by the party in 1911 revealed that 56% of the members were either self-employed or white-collar workers, predominantly teachers and office workers. Only in the former Amsterdam 3 section were there a sizable core of working-class supporters. While the SDP floundered, both the SDAP and the NVV experienced a rapid process of growth. In the year after the split, the SDAP picked up 1,000 new members, over twice what it had lost to the SDP. Starting with 9,500 members at this time of the split, the SDAP increased to 15,667 by 1913. A year later, following a spectacular rate of growth, it had reached 25,708. During the year 1913, the party's sections grew phenomenally, from 284 to 389, and the circulation of Het Volk from 23,519 to 30,149. By the eve of the war, the SDAP had become a full-fledged mass party of the working class. Significantly, much of this growth was concentrated in the large urban industrial centers, the very areas where the tribunists had placed their highest hopes. A similar pattern of growth characterized the NVV, which grew from 40,628 members in 1910 to 84,434 members in 1914. The contrast between the SDP's small membership base and the high hopes and expectations of its founders led to a continuing internal debate over the nature of the party and its relationship to the working class. For many, the disparity between the party's proclaimed mission of rallying the Dutch working class and its actual strength was so serious as to undermine the party's credibility. The SDP's small numbers, lack of concrete achievements, intransigence in practical matters, and the chiliastic nature of its propaganda all contributed to the impression that the party was little more than a sect. Snevliet spoke of this group when he left the SDP to rejoin the SDAP on the grounds that the SPDP's emphasis on disseminating Marxist principles had made it little more than, quote, a kind of Marxist Fabian society, end quote. Among the party leadership, the prevailing view was that the SDP was in a transitional stage similar to that of the SDAP during the period 1890 to 1897, when the old socialist movement had lost its strength and the new one had not yet fully matured. This maturation, they felt, would come only in the course of the turbulent new struggles of the future. Gorder summed up what he felt was the key issue in a major article entitled Sector Party. While warning of the dangers of isolation by doctrinal purity, Gorder argued that what distinguished a party from a sect was not its numbers, but its relationship to the future course of social development. Quote, whenever a group, no matter how small, bases its actions on the development of society, then it is a party, yes, the party. Science, theory, and tactics which flow from it are what makes a workers' party, not the number of members. Conversely, a workers' party whose actions are not based on the knowledge of society is not a real party, even if it is has 100,000 supporters. It is only a crowd, masses of people gathered around a troop of demagogues, end quote. Gorder made it clear that he felt that whatever its shortcomings, the SDP's existence was now completely justified by the fact that the SDAP had become a, quote, confirmed state party, end quote, with the objective function of integrating the working class into the capitalist state. The failure of the SDP to move beyond its initial membership or to make the party a political vehicle of any significant sector of the Dutch working class was rooted in both the organizational deficiencies of the party and in several factors affecting the development of the Dutch working class after 1909. The economic recovery which followed the economic crisis of 1908 to 1909 raised expectations within the working class of a major improvement in living conditions, but the workers anticipated that these improvements would be secured through the traditional trade union and parliamentary channels. with the SDAP and the NVV able to provide an alternative more suited to the immediate needs of the workers, the SDP was unable to penetrate the socialist-inclined sector of the working class. The hopes of radicalizing the Dutch working class were further checked when, starting in 1910, the SDAP initiated a series of highly successful extra-parliamentary actions on behalf of universal suffrage. Powerless to pursue a revolutionary tactic, the SDP was largely confined to evangelical activity. Only at the level of ideas was it able to offer a serious challenge to the SDAP. But despite its inability to generate a mass working class following, the SDP managed to develop during the first 5 years of its existence a clear profile that set it apart from the SDAP and enabled it to sink roots sufficiently deep enough to sustain it in the difficult years ahead. The tenacity of the new party derived in part from the nature of its theoretical concepts, but it was also sustained by a small band of organizers and propagandists who succeeded in giving the rank and file of the party a belief not only in a higher socialist mission, but also a conviction of the invincibility of their cause. Pannekoek, in an article commemorating the foundation of the Tribuna, attempted to place the party's existence in historical perspective. The SDP, he was now prepared to assert, was part of a larger current of, quote, international struggling Marxism, end quote, which was a political tendency coming, quote, increasingly to the forefront, end quote. The split within Dutch social democracy, Pannekoek felt, was only, quote, an earlier and sharper form, end quote, of political differences that were beginning to emerge on an international scale. Okay, so that is the section, that is the end of chapter 6 of Anton Pannekoek and the Socialism of Workers' Self-Emancipation, 1873 to 1960. Now I'm going to read the footnotes. So let's see what it says in the footnotes. There's a book by Karl E. Schorska titled German Social Democracy, 1905 to 1917, The Development of the Great Schism. J.P. Nettles' big famous biography, Rosa Luxemburg. While noting that Pannekoek's analysis had, quote, very great defects, end quote, lacks precision and concreteness, end quote, Lenin went on to praise Pannekoek, quote, in this controversy is Pannekoek and not Kautsky who represents Marxism, end quote. That's from State and Revolution. And I have a piece by a guy, I can't remember, I think it might be Hertz is his last name, Herz, which is a about the influence of Pannekoek on Lenin. It says, it was on these grounds that Pannekoek deliberately chose not to buttress his arguments for the necessity of smashing the capitalist state with citations from Marx's The Civil War in France. It says, the most comprehensive source of information on the origins and development of left-wing radicalism in Bremen is Karl Ernst Morling's book, Die Sozialdemokratische Partei in Bremen, 1890 to 1914, Reformismus und Radikalismus in der Sozialdemokratischen Partei Bremens, Hanover, 1968. Footnote, for a biography of Radek, see Warren Lerner, Karl Radek, The Last Internationalist. see. It says Snevely later became a founder of the communist movement in Indonesia and a key emissary of the Communist International in China. From the mid-1920s onward, he was a leading figure in the Trotskyist opposition in Europe. In 1942, he was executed by the Nazis for his activity in the resistance. And footnote. Okay, yeah, and that's the end of the notes. Thank you so much for listening.